Okay, do you hear me? Yes. Let's get started. So hello everyone, welcome to the OpenStack Summit. My name is Thierry. I work for the Openstack Foundation, and the clicker is not working. Yes. And today I wanted to talk about the new strategy, the new integration strategy that we introduced in Sydney for the Openstack Foundation. Do a more deeper dive into the motivation behind it, the story, why we ended up changing things, and the consequences, short-term, long-term, for the Openstack Foundation and for the Openstack project and others. There should be plenty of time for questions at the end of this talk. It's a short presentation. We'll be using the mics so that the questions are recorded, as well as the answers. So let's dive in. Back in 2017, we had the number of parallel discussions that all pointed to a similar need for a change. You have to know that OpenStack started very project-focused. Basically, everything we did was the production of the OpenStack software, to the point where the community was actually defined by what we built. By what we produced. That was actually reinforced when we did the project structure reform in 2015, which was dubbed the Big Tent, which basically said that everything that our community produces, everything that the OpenStack community produces is obviously a part of OpenStack. So basically, we equated exactly the community that was producing software with the software being produced. And that was really excellent to quickly build a very strong community around OpenStack, capture all the excitement there was around the technology, all the energy that was sent to the project. It helped us grow to the massive size that we are today. But by 2017, it was pretty clear that we are hitting some of the limits of that model. Being project-centric means you're very isolationist in nature because everything happens within your community. You only care about what's happening within your community. And that makes it very difficult to cooperate with adjacent communities or to adopt pieces of the technologies they're developing. But the main issue that we're hitting in 2017 was more that we created a lot of confusion as to what OpenStack really is. Because whatever our community builds is not really a great way of focusing a product in a way that people can understand it. And that was actually framed in one of the strategy sessions that we had with the leadership of the Openstack Foundation. So the board of directors, the technical committee, the user committee, and the Openstack Foundation staff met in March of last year, March of 2017. To discuss the strategic issues that we needed to work on for the coming year. And one of them was to better communicate what is OpenStack. And as a result of that work in the strategy session, we introduced the Openstack Map, which was shown during the keynote this morning. So the map shows what the community produces, but more from a user perspective, like what are the pieces of software that you might be interested in deploying to solve a specific problem. The central piece is the OpenStack Cloud Infrastructure Framework, which has multiple components, but they're all providing a service that will be consumed by cloud end users through APIs. On the right side, you see tools that you can add on to your OpenStack Cloud to facilitate operations, so monitoring tools, billing, or things that let you leverage multiple clouds. At the bottom is the tooling that you can, the recipes and the tools that you can use to deploy OpenStack or to manage the lifecycle of an OpenStack installation. So it's more geared toward deployers, actually. And on the left side, you see bridges that let you consume that technology. So SDKs, client libraries that let you actually consume those resources, or bridges that let you leverage individual OpenStack components from other stacks like Kubernetes or others. So that lets us really target the various components that we produce to the people that might be interested in deploying them. Like a cloud user might be interested in deploying the OpenStack client software, or someone that's coming from the Kubernetes community might be interested in Courier or Fuxi. And that gives us clarity about what OpenStack really is from a product perspective, and helps us see what fits in the map and what does not fit in the map. Another discussion we had around 2017 is around our continuous integration systems. One thing that every community that I travel to agrees on is that one thing we did really well in OpenStack is building continuous integration in from day zero. And as OpenStack evolved, that system really evolved to meet the need of the massive rate of changes that we had around the OpenStack project. The sad part is that this incredible system that we built to sustain the OpenStack development was invisible to other communities or other people, other open source projects, because it was seen as the OpenStack project infrastructure. The fact that it's extremely reusable was completely lost with the OpenStack thing being the only thing we promoted. So we had a problem there that we wanted to fix. Another thing that happened during 2017, those are all parallel discussions that happened around the same time, pointing to the similar need for a change, is a demand for more support from the Openstack Foundation. We had nascent open source communities coming to us. We had organizations wanting to create open collaboration around other open infrastructure problems. And they were coming to us because they liked the way we handled projects. They liked the principles that we had with the OpenStack project, and they wanted us to help them with setting up other open collaborative open source projects. And our answers was either we could fit it in the OpenStack project, further diluting what we'd meant by OpenStack, or we just said no. And we weren't able, there are lots of really interesting technologies that we weren't able to support the creation of due to our model that was everything is OpenStack and we don't do anything except OpenStack. Yet another parallel discussion that we had around 2017 is the same organization that were helping us build this great cloud infrastructure platform that is OpenStack were interested in exploring models for deploying infrastructure in different ways beyond the traditional central cloud model, especially more distributed ways of providing infrastructure. Edge computing is one of them. It's the idea of putting compute resources closer to where they are actually consumed to enable lower latency applications like augmented reality or cell phone carriers applications. And while OpenStack is a perfect match for some of those needs, some components of OpenStack are really a great match for that, it's not enough. Like, it's a specific use case, and you have to develop other pieces of technology or glue with other projects to make it work. The final discussion that really struck a chord with me for signaling a need for change was discussing with our users and realizing that they were mixing and matching open infrastructure technologies to solve their infrastructure needs, and how difficult that integration was, that they had to reinvent a lot of things from scratch all over again, suffering from lack of end-to-end user end-to-end testing or lack of stronger ties between those technologies. And that really pointed to integration being the last mile in open infrastructure adoption. If we could facilitate that integration, that would go a long way with those users and their real needs at this point. We had lots of exciting open source technologies, but integrating them is still very hard. So at that point, it was pretty clear that we knew we had to change something, but we wanted to make sure that we stayed true to our roots. We decided to take a step back and look at our original motivation. Why did we start this OpenStack thing 7 years ago? And at the very start of OpenStack, there is this strong belief that in order to create really successful open source technology, open source is not enough. You have to do an open collaboration. And by open collaboration, I mean an open source project where anyone, any individual, any organization can contribute as an equal on a level playing field without one of them holding the keys to the kingdom. And I really personally think that it's key to attracting sufficient contribution and sufficient adoption to make that technology successful. The other key strong belief that we had at the beginning of OpenStack is that we did not want a world where every infrastructure needs would be provided by a couple of internet giants, that we needed an open source solution to enable anyone to access that technology and make it more broadly adopted. I think that's pretty clear from the keynotes this morning. There were excellent content that showed what we meant by open infrastructure. And I think that was a thing we wanted to preserve in whatever we changed to adapt to the challenges we had. Another thing that we really care about is when we started the foundation, we wanted to recognize the importance of both upstream and downstream work. Some foundations are really good at the upstream work, which is about enabling development communities, making sure you have a healthy software development environment. And some foundations are really good at helping with the downstream stuff, like running events, creating a marketplace of users, engaging with vendors. And that's one thing that we wanted to do, is striking a balance between those two things. We don't have to do upstream or downstream. We need to realize that one cannot be successful without the other. And that's something we did really early on when we created the foundation, having both of those expertises in-house. And finally, we really believe in the virtues of having fun. We're embarking on an ambitious journey, and if it's not funny, if we don't remember to not take it too seriously and remember to have fun along the way, we don't create a community that is really nice to be in. And that's another thing that we wanted to keep, whatever we changed, is keeping having fun so that we stayed engaged and motivated. So that was our original motivation, but we also wanted to look back at what we built over the last 7 years that we should definitely reuse, take stock of what we successfully created beyond just OpenStack that we need to preserve in any change that we do. The first thing is this great coalition of organizations that are the OpenStack community at large. Those are all rallied around the concept of openly developing an open infrastructure solution. Could be competitors to the big 3 public cloud providers wanting to build an alternate public cloud infrastructure provider, or it could be retail or entertainment companies that are not really interested in funding their own long-term extinction by financing Amazon AWS huge margins. Or it could be public research organizations like CERN or the Cancer Research Institute we saw this morning that could not afford to run their mind-boggling compute needs on top of public clouds. Or it could be organizations in China or other countries in the world that are not really looking forward a world where all the infrastructure is provided by US-based providers. So all of those organizations that rejected this idea that all of infrastructure will forever be provided by a handful of companies rallied around that need for openly developing a solution for open infrastructure. So we needed to listen to that group and make sure that we preserve it. Another thing that we successfully created is a network of events. We organize here, we are at the OpenStack Summit, global events. We also encourage local OpenStack days, local communities to throw up their own events. We also organize a set of meetups and a project teams gathering, which is our contributor-driven event. Those events collectively reach out to 20,000 people every year, and whatever we change, we should make sure we preserve that great outreach mechanism. Another thing we did over the past 7 years is we fostered this great user community. Users engage, willing to share their experiences, and we should make sure that we leverage that. We should make sure that we integrate that as much as we can in the process. And finally, our project infrastructure. We built this openly operated set of open source projects that scaled to the needs of the OpenStack project, and we should make sure that we reuse that. So that's it. We looked back at our original motivation. We looked at what we built over the past 7 years that we should preserve, and we'll then design this new approach that was explained in Sydney, but I'll go over it again. The central piece of it is a discussion shift from being project-oriented, creating a solution, building software, building OpenStack, really focused on the production of the software, to discussions that are more goal-oriented, integrating various solutions to solve a problem space, building open infrastructure solutions rather than just OpenStack, solving problems for users. And that's what the key of this cycle for areas, finding common use cases, discussing with users, see what they want to explore, collaborate with other communities, see what they built, see what we can reuse. If there is anything missing, any piece of the puzzle that is missing, support the creation of that new technology in an open collaborative manner. And finally, testing everything end to end so that it actually works together, which is extremely important, as we saw this morning. So we wanted to apply this recipe to various open infrastructure specific problems. So we had to define specific areas that we wanted specifically to focus on. Those focus areas are the data center cloud, which is the traditional problem space that OpenStack helps solving. But another problem space that we wanted to explicitly explore was edge computing. Basically, if you want to push compute resources to the edge, you need lots of micro deployments that will need to be interoperable and built on standards. And we think open source has a great role to play there. We don't really want a proprietary platform to be the solution that will be everywhere and solve every problem at the edge. It needs open source, obviously. The other aspect we wanted to look into is container infrastructure. Like, to truly integrate containers in an open infrastructure solution, you need to look at it end to end with an eye towards security. And that's what the container infrastructure the focus area is about. And finally, continuous integration, continuous deployment. What are the steps to go from code being written by a developer to a service being consumed by a user, and facilitate that transition from code to service. One thing that is interesting is that those various focus areas are not necessarily at the same stage in that cycle. So for Edge, like Ildiko said during the keynote, most of the focus was on finding common use cases, discussing a common vocabulary, because they were not agreeing what they meant by Edge. So over the past year, most of the focus is about discussing the use cases. For the container infrastructure area, it's more between 2 and 3. We've been heavily collaborating with the Kubernetes community, but also looking into pieces of technology that were missing to fully deliver open infrastructure on a container on an open infrastructure. So obviously, the most visible pieces of what we provide here is the new projects. We heard this morning about Zool and Kata Containers, but it's just the most visible part of the iceberg, and I don't want that to derail the discussion around the fact that we are focusing on new focus areas, because sometimes it's just discussing, supporting a work group to discuss the vocabulary. Sometimes it's helping build communities, giving more visibility to projects that were already there and did not get the visibility they deserve. So it's different set of actions for each of those focus areas, but obviously the most visible part is the projects that we end up producing. So obviously we still have OpenStack. OpenStack is the base for all of the open infrastructure efforts. It powers cloud infrastructure. It's a framework of components you can use to deploy cloud infrastructure to provide infrastructure services to your users. Had about 7,000 contributors since 2012, because apparently we can't count before 2012. It was created in 2010, but we did not really count well before. And we had 80,000. It's just me being lazy, because before 2012, we were not using Git. 80,000 changes merged in 2017 alone, which makes OpenStack one of the largest, if not the largest, most active open source project in existence. But we did our 17th release back in February, the Queen's release. And you will probably learn more about it over this cycle. over this summit, sorry. Kata Containers, it's a secure container runtime. You will also learn a lot about it this week. It's really, to me, the missing piece to securely run containers on an open infrastructure. So it's really the product of that, of thinking about container infrastructure in an end-to-end manner. Obviously, it runs with Docker and Kubernetes, but it helps with the use case of running containers on an open infrastructure. It's a collaboration with code from Intel and Hyper.sh, so clear containers from Intel and runv from Hyper.sh. And they came together to work on the same solution rather than have competitive solution, which was a really great match for how we do things in OpenStack, which is an open collaboration manner. It reminds me of how Nova and Swift from NASA and Rackspace came to create OpenStack at the beginning. They had about 35 contributors, 1,250 commits, and the 1.0 will be released tomorrow if everything goes well. And finally, Zool. Zool is a scalable CI engine. Jim is here, so I won't say too many things. To me, it does speculative execution of tests for a pipeline of interdependent changes. But I like the new phrasing where it's cross-community CI. Like, I really like this idea that it's a piece of software you can use to actually test changes across multiple communities with dependencies between them, because it supports our whole messaging there. It was created in 2012 to support the explosive growth of the OpenStack project, because we reached the limits of the existing open source solutions. Last time I looked, which is a few weeks ago, there were 80 contributors, 4,200 commits. The tagline is "Stop merging broken code," which is awesome. V3.0 was out last March. Now it's at 3.0.3, and you should really look into it because it's really cool technology. Okay, how am I doing with time? Not too bad. Okay. So I know there are lots of questions about the consequences of that strategy, especially from the OpenStack project people, because there is fear that means dilution of resources, fear that we move away from OpenStack. So I want to address those questions before we get to Q&A. So for the foundation, obviously the obvious consequence is that we are not just doing OpenStack anymore. We also support other projects, other brands. Which creates kind of a branding challenge for the foundation because it's called the Openstack Foundation. So I'm happy that our trademark lawyers are in the room, and they will get busy. There is also a bylaws challenge because if you read the Openstack Foundation bylaws, it's very, very OpenStack centric. So we might have to change a few things there. From a foundation staff perspective, we also needed to reorganize a bit to better support those various focus areas because we were more traditionally upstream and downstream teams, and we're now much more interacting with each other to help enabling those various focus areas. So it's challenging, but it's not too difficult. For the OpenStack project, the reality is it doesn't change that much. OpenStack is still the central piece of our strategy, the base for open infrastructure solutions. We actively reuse components from OpenStack in every of those other focus areas. If anything, I think it's really an opportunity for OpenStack to refocus and refine what is OpenStack with less distractions from all the projects that just wanted to be within the OpenStack Foundation. So it will let the OpenStack community be more opinionated on what OpenStack is and what OpenStack is not, if you don't have to call everything we do OpenStack, basically. We should also see, I think we'll see a shift toward more reusable components, because with all those various focus areas, I expect that since a number of components from OpenStack will be reusable outside of a traditional OpenStack deployment, we'll have more and more focus on reusable components within the OpenStack framework. For our infrastructure, there were also a lot of questions. Obviously, it will get the visibility it deserves. It should result in serving more than just OpenStack. We're seeing Obviously, it serves OpenStack and Zool development, but we're seeing more and more projects that are choosing to deploy on our infrastructure. It's always been the case. We always had an area where anyone could create their open source project and be supported on our infrastructure, but we did not really promote that as much. So it should be more apparent now. We need to work on governance, because currently the OpenStack infrastructure team is the OpenStack infrastructure team, which means it's under the technical committee governance, the OpenStack technical committee governance, and we need to reinvent a more neutral governance model there that still takes into account the needs of the projects that are consuming that infrastructure, so we need to work on that. And finally, we hope that there will be new resources, human resources or cloud resources invested in the OpenStack project infrastructure as a result of that increased visibility. OK, that's almost there. I'm sure you're hungry, so I'll keep it short. Before we go to Q&A, I would just wanted to address this fear that all those new areas and new projects mean dilution of our principles. For example, we give new projects much more freedom in choosing the tooling and language they use than if they are an OpenStack component. Like, for example, Kata Containers is developed on GitHub, while OpenStack has a pretty strong stance rejecting proprietary development platforms. So there is this legitimate question of, does that mean that anything goes? Like, where are the red lines for a project under the Openstack Foundation? So I think it's worth reiterating. The 4 opens define the way we do open source at the Openstack Foundation. Open source means that everything we do is open source. Everything is under an open source license. But beyond that, we don't do open core. We do not encourage or support the upselling of features in a proprietary, enterprise version of the software. We do open development, which means that everything we do in the development is transparent, accessible. Anyone can participate. Everything is happening on public forums. We go one step further by doing open design. It's not a closed group of developers that discuss the future of the platform while everyone else is just there to fix bugs. We are actually doing open design this week with the forum sessions during the OpenStack Summit. So you will see open design in action. And finally, open community. Contribution is our only currency. We have governance bodies that are elected by the contributors to the project. There is no appointed seats. And everyone can grow and become a leader in our community. You don't have to be from one company or another. So these 4 opens really stage how we do open source at the OpenStack Foundation. And we need to make sure that all those organizations that come to us to help them set up projects understand that is the base and that it has value. And the other thing is basic governance. We want to have contributor-driven bodies. We want to limit governance to places where you actually need to make decisions, like no vanity boards and that kind of stuff. We want to limit the number of bodies, but we still want them to be strongly aligned with their constituency. It's one good open source principle governance that you need to make sure that whoever represents you is actually quite aligned with what you're saying. So that's the reason why we don't have a global technical committee for all the projects, because otherwise the bigger project, which is OpenStack, would basically eat all the other projects and make the decisions for them. So we have different governance for Kata Containers and OpenStack. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't work on complementarity, and I'll get to that. Yeah, finally, we are not interested in grabbing every interesting project out there. It's not a land grab where anything goes. All projects need to be about open infrastructure, and we need to paint a complementarity overarching story. They need to play well together. And to help with that, we want to develop more synergies between those projects, because we won't have a governance body forcing, as a forcing function to force them to collaborate, but we want to engage with them and convince them that we are stronger together than separately. And we'll have a forum session on that Thursday at 3:30 p.m. where leadership from OpenStack, Zuul, Kata Containers will gather to discuss those integration points, making sure that we reuse as much of their technology as we can, that help them better scope what they're offering, see where they could do more for one another. And that will happen in typical open design fashion. Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Please join us if you're interested in that. And that concludes this talk. Thank you. So is there any question? We have 10 minutes for questions. Mike.
Can you tell us more about the governance? So there will be one board, I guess, and different TCs for the different projects. But what happens with the user committee and all these committees which are now specific to like OpenStack, the cloud?
So we have one board of directors because there is one foundation, it's not multiple foundations. For the technical governance, so OpenStack is a technical committee. The other projects should also have a body that drives them. It depends on the exact shape of the focus area. In some cases, there will be very complementary projects that will need a lot of synergies. And it goes back to where are decisions needed. You know, if you end up with two projects that share nothing and don't really are both on the edge use case, for example, but are completely separate from a technical perspective, there aren't so many technical decisions that need to be made across those projects. So having a governance body on top of those projects might not make sense, but rather a governance body per project in that focus area. So it's really, the answer is it depends. On the user committee side, I think it's important to have a group that makes sure that the voice of the users are fed back into development. So one way or another, I'm not sure a user committee, strictly speaking, will be the best solution for every single one of them. Like for Zuul, the way I see it is more that we need to structure the consumers of the project infrastructure so that they can feedback into the Zuul development team. But I'm not sure we would call it a user committee. It would probably be like a project, consuming project advisory, whatever, or just, in the end, it's just having the names of the people that you need to contact to hear from that project more than anything else. So the same way OpenStack uses the user committee as a way to ask questions about the OpenStack users, it's convenient for developers to just say, well, let's ask the user committee. It's their job to represent them. In the case of Zuul, I can see how they could have a name in the OpenStack community, in other communities, to ask the questions that they have. So let's ask the OpenStack representative to tell us exactly what we need to know. I mean, it will depend, obviously, on how many projects we'll end up having. It's still very much being defined, but the true important thing is making sure that it's a contributor-driven technical governance, that you don't make more than the number of governance bodies that you actually need, and that the voice of the user can be fed back into development one way or another, but we're still experimenting there won't be like a recipe that will apply to every project. I'm not seeing that happening. Even if my OCD would like to call them exactly the same name, technical committee, user committee, I'm not sure that's the right wording for those various things. Like for the Edge group, we don't really need a technical committee yet. Like you're barely discussing the vocabulary for it, so it's not needed yet. Don't over-optimize prematurely, I guess, is what we want to do. You have to know that OpenStack governance took like 5 years before we actually settled with the model we have today, and it experienced like meteoric growth during that phase. So I'm actually happy that we accepted to evolve and change rather than come with a model that would be one size fits all. And I expect those other communities to be in the same situation. Other questions?
Hey, William Fellows at 451 Research. So, is the at a high level, is the goal here, the direction of travel, to build a services stack which is similar in function to those that are available that the commercial cloud service vendors provide, like Amazon or Google or Microsoft? And second piece, to what extent do you anticipate that you will work more closely with the Linux Foundation and Cloud Native Foundation and perhaps even take on some of their projects?
So the question is, repeating for the recording, it is the goal to do a stack that is more like the first part of the question, more like the Amazon cloud stack or something else. I think it's beyond the Amazon model or the Google model. It's really, basically, for example, edge. Edge computing is one thing where the traditional data center-centric, huge data center cloud model will not apply. And so if we just focused on replicating whatever Amazon does, we would have missed, and we would miss this opportunity where open source being deployed everywhere at the edge might end up being so interoperable and so seamlessly usable that you end up with one open source solution that lets you drive all of that, whatever the provider, the physical provider ends up being. And so I don't like to think of it as obviously that the OpenStack feature set is tracking with some of the Amazon features like the serverless thing, Lambda, yeah, Sigma, Lambda. So we have a project that does offer the same kind of infrastructure services there, but from this strategy shift perspective, it's really more about exploring open infrastructure as a general landscape and provide those solutions. And the cloud native part of it is a part of the open infrastructure puzzle. Like we are collaborating with the CNCF and especially the Kubernetes community as Kubernetes becomes this generic API for deploying applications and is very successful at conquering that layer of the stack. That's why the shift from being project-centric to being goal-oriented is really useful for us, because as long as you're just project-centric, I'm just discussing OpenStack. Well, why am I even talking about Kubernetes? But we started this shift where at the OpenStack Summit, you hear a lot about other pieces of technology because we're not really territorial about it. These are things that our users, we have the same users. CERN did a keynote at KubeCon in Copenhagen 1 month ago or 2 weeks ago, whatever, and we are having basically this. It's the same stack with OpenStack and Kubernetes on top of it, and it's great that we are very happy that they're leveraging that piece of technology. We can't really invent everything in house. I think it's like a red herring, and so with a more goal-oriented focus, you end up being able to better coordinate, cooperate, leverage those pieces of technology that are successfully built in other communities and integrate them and then test them end to end without it being too weird for like the OpenStack Summit to discuss Kubernetes. So I was very much involved in reaching out to the Kubernetes community and to better explain where OpenStack fits in their stack because the original thing was more like, oh, it's competition for OpenStack, or it's like in parallel, and explaining that it's not a zero-sum game, that we can use Kubernetes to deploy OpenStack, we can deploy Kubernetes on top of OpenStack. Those are extremely complementary solutions. So I've been working on that for the last 2 years now, and I think it's beared fruit recently with clearly a shift in how OpenStack is perceived in those communities. It's much more seen as a complementary solution, and the addition of the OpenStack cloud provider within Kubernetes really clarifies where OpenStack fits in the community stack. And I think it's great work that we've been driving. Chris Hodge at the foundation's been driving there. Other questions? Well, thank you again for attending, and I'll be seeing you around this week.